In this audio-visual presentation, entitled Old Amersham Now Then, we have taken photographs and video recordings, where possible, from the same locations as that taken by George Ward. His photographs have provided us with a real insight into life as it was in Amersham in the 1800s and 1900s. Most of the images appearing in this presentation were produced from his original negatives. Here is just a sample of his work. This is Mr. Ayres, the blacksmith, in 1883. Mr. Redrup enjoying his pipe in 1888. And a member of the horse-drawn fire brigade in 1889. Mr. North and his class a year later in 1890. And a photo taken the same year is Mrs. Drake, the squire's wife, at Shardlows. And here's a mother and daughter in 1892. And preparing for war, 1914. But first, an interesting comment about Amersham from the 16th century scholar John Leyland. He said, "Amersham is a right pretty market town, well built with timber." So, what do we really know about this town nestling in the heart of the Chiltern Hills? In 1972, the Amersham Society erected a black stone at the town hall. It provides us with very interesting historical information. It reads, "In Saxon time, this town was called Agmondisham. The Domesday Book of 1086 records it as Elmondisham, with 3 watermills in use along the banks of the Misbourne." It goes on to say that in the year 1200, King John granted Amersham the right to hold a market and fair every year forever. Amersham was an active centre of dissident from the 14th century onwards, and some inhabitants suffered martyrdom. This memorial commemorates the deaths of 6 men and 1 woman. They were local Protestants and Lollards. They were burnt at the stake in 1506 and in 1524. During the Civil War, Amersham strongly adhered to the parliamentary cause. Oliver Crumble's wife lived with her daughters at Woodrow High House, just a mile or 2 from Amersham. In the 17th century, Amersham was the home of prominent Quakers, who suffered great persecution. And finally, the plaque tells us that in the 18th century, Amersham was the centre of black lace making industry. So, let's start our presentation here. Our first place of interest is Bury Farm. This is where William Penn courted his first wife, a Miss Guillemar Springett. William Penn was an English Quaker leader and an advocate of religious freedom. He oversaw the founding of Pennsylvania for Quakers and other religious minorities in Europe. Later, Bury Farm was the equivalent of Amersham's Manor House, and would have been the house of the Lord of the Manor's agent. So let's move on now to the town itself. At the London end of the Broadway, this cottage bears a notice warning, "All common beggars, ballad singers and other vagrants will be apprehended and dealt with according to the law." We have now reached the widest part of the Broadway. Amersham's largest tannery, run by the Salter family, was located behind these cottages on the extreme right of this photograph. The site was later used for the gasworks, started in 1885. Due to the demand in gas, a second gas holder was built in Tanyard. The construction of the gas holder and the disruption to the streets was considerable, as we see here in Wealdon Street. Now back to the Broadway. Here we have a wider view of the Broadway, showing the electricity substation and the alley complex. So, how did the alley complex come about? Stallholders, whose families had traded there for generations, were allowed to build cottages on the site of the former stalls, providing sufficient room was allowed for passing traffic. Across the road from the alley complex, we arrive at our first public house, the Griffin. Griffin Inn, as we can see, has a high coach entrance. The building was refronted in brick in the early 19th century. By 1790, the cost of travelling by stagecoach from Amersham to London was 7 shillings inside the coach and 3 shillings and sixpence on top of the coach. It was travel for the gentry, as the labourer's annual wage was £12 a year. During the Civil War in the 17th century, musters of the parliamentary troops passed through Amersham on their way to Aylesbury, although Cromwell is reputed to have dined at the Griffin. Before leaving the inn, our next photo shows an interior shot showing a timber frame and a section of wattle and daub infilling. Just a short walk from the Griffin, at the junction of the Broadway and Wilton Street, are shops. But what shops were there in the 1800s? The first one was Mead's Grocers. At the turn of the century, new wide windows had been inserted, and here the owner, Mr. Mead, stands proudly at the door. The opposite side of the road was the corner house. This small shop window shows vests, shirts and bowler hats with price tags clearly visible. We now have the marketplace just ahead of us. Some location shots were recorded here for the film As He Was Born. The film was made in the early part of the 19th century. Some locals worked as extras, and this plaster statue prop was erected in the market square. We're now under the market hall. The date is 1884. The arch on the right was blocked up as a result of the Public Safety Act of 1911. It required that public buildings should have 2 exits, so a second flight of stairs was built in its place. If we walk through the arch and turn immediately to the right, we're outside Mr. Stevens' butcher's shop, tucked away behind the market hall, what is now called Market Walk. It's 1904. Mr. Stevens stands with a prize bull and some assistants. Across the road, immediately opposite where Mr. Stevens is standing, was George Ward's shop. He sold cycle parts, torches and batteries. George Ward was without doubt multi-talented. In addition to his photographic skills, which we mentioned earlier, he was a successful businessman, he was a town councillor, cycle and motor engineer, musician, founder of the Amersham Town Band. Just a short walk from George Ward's shop on the same side of the road, we passed a house which was originally a linen factory, where the poor might be found work. The photograph shows the building decorated for the coronation of Edward VII in 1901. On the way to our next public house, the King's Arms, we pass these young ladies on their way to the annual flower show. We've now arrived at the King's Arms. The front elevation is not that old. It wasn't renovated until the 1930s. A point of interest, the first film on the highwayman Dick Turpin was filmed here. In very recent times, that is in 1994, the King's Arms featured in a very successful film, 4 Weddings and a Funeral, starring Hugh Grant and Andy McDowell. For the film, the King's Arms was renamed the Jolly Boatman, and some of the inside shots for the film were recorded at the Crown Hotel. Before leaving the King's Arms, we see in the next photo the Lower Baptist Sunday School outing setting off for Burnham Beeches in 1890. Further up the High Street is the Worthies. Once an old farmhouse, the first of these cottages has 16th century murals of the 9 murals adorning the walls. The 9 Worthies are historical, scriptural and legendary personages who personify the ideas of chivalry in the Middle Ages. Continuing our journey along the High Street, we come to William Drake's almshouses. They were built in 1657 for poor widows of the parish over the age of 50. Our next stopping point is the Swan. It was another coaching inn. One of the chimneys is dated 1671, but the building is thought to be older. There are references in legal documents to the Swan in 1695, and the word Swan is spelled S-W-A-N-N-E. Across the road from the Swan is Turpin's Row. It took its name not from the highwayman, but from an 18th century owner, Thomas Turpin. If we go past Turpin's Row, we see Town Mill. Town Mill is almost certainly on one of the Domesday sites. In addition to Town Mill, there are two other mills. One was at Weller's Brewery in Church Street, the other was at the Mill Stream. We will return now down the High Street in the direction of the Town Hall. On the way, we pass Wee Oaks, the smallest house in the town. It's a late 16th century or early 17th century property. It's a one up, one down, but later extended at the back. We then move on to the Elephant Castle, where flour is being delivered. Further down the High Street, an eye-catching sight, a powerful advert for a Torah, Huggins Beef Suet, a cart pulled by oxen, aptly named Suet and Dumpling. Adjacent to the town hall, the road is being resurfaced. Without the equipment we have today, the work was very labour intensive and must have been extremely back-breaking work. Just past the marketplace, on the other side of the road, is the Crown Hotel. It's an ancient timber frame building owned by the Drakes of Shardlows and tenanted by John Fowler at the turn of the 19th century. John Fowler is recorded as a victualler in Amersham town. He's said to have owned 10 horses, 2 wagons and 3 carts. Fowler employed an ostler to attend to the stagecoach horses. He employed postboys who would ride with the post horses harnessed to a private coach. He also hired out coach and horses for post-chaise, similar to us hiring a long-distance cab today. The recently retired rector of Amersham, the Reverend Tim Harper, wrote, and I quote, "St Mary's Church, Old Amersham, dates from around 1140 AD, though the site has been a holy one for much longer, as it stands where the Roman road crosses the little river Misbourne. The missionary monks of St Augustine, and indeed earlier evangelist bishops, would baptize their converts at such a location. The interior of St Mary's today in 2022 is very different to 1895, when it had polished pews and candelabra lighting." So let's return to the Broadway, to another place of interest. This was the grammar school, founded under the terms of the will of the Reverend Robert Challoner. It occupied this building in front of the parish church until 1905, and then the school was moved to new premises at Amersham on the Hill. Well, that completes our tour of Old Amersham. However, we must not forget the dark chapter in the town's history. We are, of course, referring to the Great War, 1914 to 1918. In the early stages of the war, the army was very much in evidence in Old Amersham and the surrounding area. Here we see the King's Royal Rifles on parade in the Broadway in 1914. They are waiting for the squire's agent to inform them of the address of their billet. During the First World War, the King's Royal Rifles were billeted in Amersham, Missenden and Chesham. Here the regiment is drilling at Pondwicks. They were later inspected by George V in the High Street in November 1914. Conscription in the First World War was not introduced until January 1916, when the Military Service Act was passed, so it's very likely that these men were volunteers. but many of them would have had very little idea of what lay ahead. Within a few days of standing in Old Amersham High Street, they were thrust into the jaws of hell. The Armistice Service of 1918 was held at St Mary's. A memorial cross was installed in the churchyard and later moved to the Memorial Gardens in 1949. The memorial reads, "To the glory and memory of the men of Amersham who gave their lives in the Great War of Freedom." In more recent times, the statue of a First World War soldier also stands in the Memorial Gardens, a poignant and an additional reminder to us all of those young men who did not return to Amersham. Over 1,000 men and women from Amersham and the surrounding area had direct involvement in the Great War, either in the military or supporting those who were fighting. Returning to a near normal life immediately after the war would have proved extremely difficult. However, by the 1920s, some people appeared to be enjoying their newfound freedom. Playing football, playing cricket, going to the fair. It's worth noting that Old Amersham escaped the ravages of Victorian and 20th century development, largely because its railway station came as late as 1892, and then it was almost a mile away at Amersham on the Hill. So today we can enjoy this charming town, full of character, with houses dating back as far as 1450. So just to reiterate on the 16th century scholar John Leyland, who said at the beginning of our presentation, Amersham is a right pretty market town, well built with timber. Well, over 400 years later, his words would be equally apt, as the town is without doubt one of the best preserved in England.